Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caitlin Kenny from the Western New York Library Resources Council. My pronouns are she and her. Thank you for joining us for this presentation, Calm, Legally Cool, and Collected, Tactics for Libraries Facing Book Challenges and Collection-Based Protests. This webinar is sponsored by the Empire State Library Network. Before we get started, I'm taking care of some housekeeping. I'm available to help you with any technical problems you have during this presentation, including sound, captioning, or CE and CTLE certificates. If you need assistance, please drop me a line in the chat. We will be utilizing the chat as well as the Q&A feature for this presentation. We'd appreciate it if you could change your settings so your messages are going to everyone instead of just hosts and panelists. You can change this by opening your chat box and clicking on the drop-down menu above the text box. And as you see everyone doing so, feel free to introduce yourself there now. Please use the Q&A feature to ask questions to Stephanie so that they don't get lost in the chat. You can find that towards the bottom center of your screen. Live captioning is available for this webinar. To toggle the subtitles on or off, click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and choose either show subtitle or hide subtitles. All attendees are expected to follow a code of conduct, which will be added to the chat shortly. To summarize, please treat all staff, event attendees, and speakers with respect. Those who are not adhering to the code of conduct will be removed from the webinar. This session is being recorded and a link to the recording will be shared next week. Please check your email for that link. Keep an eye on the chat. About 3/4 of the way through this session, we will drop a link for the CE and CTLE certificates. You will need to attend the live broadcast to get that link. We will not be offering certificates of attending for watching the recording. I'm also including a link in the chat to our Padlet where you can share commentary. Stephanie has a few questions for you to answer about book challenges in your community. If you've never used Padlet before, all you have to do is click on the plus sign under each comment, each heading, and you can type in your comment or your thoughts and then click publish and it will show up. All responses can be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about putting your names or anything. Now that I've completed the housekeeping, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Cole Adams, who is the Winnie Lark Ask the Lawyer attorney. The service includes availability of input on challenge and protest response. Cole is a trustee of the Freedom to Read Foundation, which operates in conjunction with the ALA's Merit Fund to provide aid to library professionals impacted by content challenges. Her law practice includes First Amendment and information access issues. Cole, you can begin.
Thank you, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. And I just want to say, joining me from my team here in Buffalo, New York, I have Jill and Whitney, who will help me keep an eye on the chat, because if you've been on a presentation with me before, you know I sometimes get really into it, and because these legal points are very interesting, and they're here to help me keep grounded and keep connected with you. Because while this is a legal session, this session is really about your on-the-ground experience as information professionals. This session is really, really geared towards practical tips, right? It's tactical, as you can see here in the name of the presentation. So this is not any law professor out there or any of my former faculty here on, probably not. We're not really going to be talking about the civil liberties, the deep case law and what's happening nationwide. At the end of the session, you're going to see I've got a link to a great session ALA is going to present next week that I think they're going to cover that at the high level, as well as continuing the discussion about what people can do and advocacy when this happens. So with that, we're going to jump right in here about what is the goal of our session. Here you are taking the time, I'm very appreciative. What are we hoping to achieve today? Frontline workers and library leadership should have an easily learned coordinated playbook for facing challenges and protests in the moment. The questions I get on these issues aren't about what's right and what's wrong. It's how do we get through this, right? How do I handle someone who's threatening to sue us, or maybe filing a FOIL request to get our entire, a PDF of our entire collection, or all the little things that happen when there's a formal or informal protest related to content in a collection. So that is really the goal here. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm an on-the-ground attorney, and the goal of this session isn't to turn you into a legal scholar. It's to give you really good tips and knowing why you're using those tactics. So how does that break down? I'm not going to read all of this, but it's in your materials. And I did add something to this bulleted list, and I really want to thank TC Ferretto and Alicia Thompson, Erie Boses, and Cheryl Knabb at Winnie Lurk for having a little pre-session with me, because I wanted to hear what were the concerns that were coming in from people, right? By the time a concern gets to me, it's big, right? But they're handling things in a much more immediate way. And one of the takeaways from the discussion was that a little refresher on why it's so critical to hold the line on these issues. And by holding the line, I mean not giving in to pressure from sometimes people who are angry and passionate about content that they might have an objection to, right? Why it's important to uphold the ALA ethics, the NILA ethics, the ethics of your own institution, whether you're at a school library in a school system or a public library or an association library, why it's so important. And we're going to spend a little bit of time at the beginning on that, just so we know what ground we stand on. But then it's going to very quickly get practical, because we're going to talk about, and I know I imagine a lot of you are very excited to hear me talk about how your charter and your bylaws really are the bedrock that your response are going to sit on, and how you're legally situated to get through this, right? That's exciting for people to learn. We're going to talk then about the purpose, right, and the usefulness of having a collection policy that includes a provision for what happened, how you handle a challenge. We're going to talk about what documents can make up the playbook for handling a protest, informal or formal, and a formal challenge, right? And then we're going to walk through some scenarios, because I very much believe in experiential learning. And this session is actually the written, hopefully everyone has the handout in whatever format is most comfortable for you to interact with during the session. If not, take a moment and print it, put it on a tablet, put it up on the screen, or whatever it is that works for you, because I've tried to give a playbook for how your frontline folks, your leadership, your trustees, how everybody can come together to handle this with a minimum of panic, and with people feeling supported in whatever role they're playing. Frontline staff, director, trustees, volunteers, advocates, et cetera, right? To give you an organizational structure for handling this. And it's actually a structure that's fairly portable whenever your library might have some type of challenge that's not just about operations, but has broader implications for your community. So we're going to walk through some scenarios to do that after we talk about what's in my handy dandy guide here. And we're going to talk about techniques for de-escalating, right? They sometimes work, sometimes they don't. We'll talk about what to do when they don't. And really, really want to encourage folks to ask questions. Jill and Caitlin and Whitney are going to interrupt me when needed to make sure that we ask a question that's important in the moment, okay? So really briefly, why am I here saying this to you today? It's a diversity of experience. I worked as a page in my public library in high school, worked in my college and law school libraries. I didn't know how important and awesome it was at the time, but I interned at the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, both in college and in law school, where I got to see what does it look like when someone is protesting content. Of course, that was protests and arrests of comic book retailers and artists, but it was still a valuable insight into seeing how things evolve in the moment. And actually, hold on, I can't see my, whoop. I have trained in the National Incident Management System. Caitlin read my intro. So, and I think a big thing is, I want you to know that what is in the guide has been battle tested because I routinely work with boards in incident management. So that's where this is drawn from. Of ground rules for our session on top of what Caitlin said. The session is going to use hypothetical scenarios, but I'm not going to use hypothetical collection content. In other words, I'm not going to say, well, they pick on a book with a particular title or a particular subject matter. Right now, if anyone looks at the national trends, there is you could characterize perhaps a political commonality with some of the content challenges and protests that are coming up. However, as you all know, these protests and challenges can come from any direction, from any point of view. And it's important to respond to it in a really orderly and calm way, no matter what the motivation of the protester is, right? So I'm not going to use actual examples, but feel free to talk about your own real world examples. But we're just going to run through things in a hypothetical sense. So we're going to use careful language as we discuss our scenarios. Questions as we go, welcome. We're going to have the time at the end for the questions as well. And it's a chance for you to gather. And as was disclosed, it's being recorded. All right. So as I said, we're going to take a brief moment to think about why. Why is it so important to have your newest staff, your most experienced staff, your volunteers, if they're playing a front-facing role, right? And most certainly your trustees and for public libraries and district school libraries, making sure your attorneys are aware of what are the ethical obligations underlying a librarian's commitment and a library's duty to resist attempts to censor or control material, right? Well, it's right here in the Code of Ethics from the American Library Association. If someone wants to pop in the top 10 books on intellectual freedom and why it's critical to our democracy, feel free. I don't think I need to sell this crowd on that. But as you can see, right there, we uphold the principles of intellectual freedom and resist all efforts to censor library resources, right? That one sentence we could talk about, probably I could talk about it all day, but that's the nugget to take away of like, why do we do this? And of course, NYLA reaffirmed and endorsed this code of ethics January 31st, 2019, got that from the NYLA website. So this is why this is critical and why it's so important that no matter how it's coming in, right, the initial response is calm, cool, and collected. So current climate. I had a lot of fun finding pictures for this slide. I had a great one. Some of you, if anyone wants to put a hand up of, there's the video of the one woman who says, just move the damn book or something like that, and I got a really good shot. And I was playing around with the special effects of the news clip. And then I thought, you know what? I'm just going to make this about something positive, right? When there's trouble, look for the helpers. So I'm just going to say nationally, we know that there is a trend happening. There's an uptick in protests and content-based challenges. And I just want to say that's the reason there's a merit fund at the ALA. So as you're considering donations or if the need arises, make yourself aware of this fund. I've got the link here. The PowerPoint will be available afterward. Everyone should know about the merit fund. And if you have concerns that you as a librarian will have a personal challenge in this regard, get this information into your phone and keep it close and be ready. And be ready to support it as well. It's there for you. And I'm going to put a link to the next week's session by the ALA that's at the end of these materials as well. So that's what's happening. We know what's happening. So let's talk briefly about how the legal nature of a library situates it to respond to challenges and protests. So school district libraries, you can take a pause for a moment, because for all of our chartered libraries out there, public association, doesn't matter, school district, special district, et cetera, your libraries are independent, not-for-profit corporations chartered by the Department of Education, but nevertheless, they're just as real as the ABC Corporation, Inc., or any other incorporated or limited liability company out there. They are standalone entities that make their own decisions. And that's why no matter what type of chartered library you are, you have an independent board of trustees who governs that corporation. That's a really, really important thing. That's one of the bedrocks that you stand on, along with that charter and those bylaws, of how your library is situated to respond to a protest. Because even if the municipal council or the municipal leaders or the people in your community are angry, it comes down to that independent operation and the trained board of trustees who is committed, right? Committed to this ALA principle. And it's why, you know, when you're assembling your board books, having that ALA or as adopted NYLA code of ethics and having, you know, your own library's code of ethics right there talking about this. This is job one for your trustees, for our chartered libraries, for our school libraries who are attending. This is job one for your schools, right? And school districts are going to commit to the notion of intellectual freedom in a very different way, right? We're not going to spend a lot of time on collection management for different types of libraries, but what's important is to realize that that principle of intellectual freedom, along with educationally appropriate material in the school districts, that's what's key there as well. So independent corporations. So when, you know, we're going to talk about why, if someone gets in your face and says, how dare you have this book? Or, you know, who the heck are you? Or anything like that. I'm not encouraging you to say, this library is an independent corporation. We're entitled to do whatever we want. I'm saying this so you know this internally, right? When there's a face-to-face challenge, that might be very adrenalizing in the moment, whether it's happening online, right there in your library, or somewhere in between. So, and actually, do we have any questions on the legal nature of the library before I jump on? Okay. So what's really important is that in that independence, whether it's the school board who's in charge of the policy at the district, or a board of trustees who's in charge of the policy at your library, or perhaps your library has adopted the policies of the cooperative or other type of library system it's in, right? And that's why I've put the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library collection development policy here to show this is just one way this is done. So your library is independent in one way or another, and the board of trustees is setting the policy. The most important, the rock star of any challenge or protest is the collection development policy or collection management policy. They have slightly different names from place to place, but it's the policy that the library has to say, okay, how do we build our collection? How do we make decisions, right? And that policy, it should have either as a section or a related policy, a challenge, a reconsideration, it's sometimes called, right? Because the word challenge is kind of loaded, but a reconsideration process. So that's a really, your library is empowered to have its own policies, and this is the type of policy it has to have, must have, to get through a content-based challenge or protest. So job one, if your library or district, if you're not aware of what the collection development policy is for your particular library, is to find that, right? And to make sure it's in place, and to make sure that the leadership of your library or your is very aware of it and committed to it being followed, because there's very precise rules for, as you'll see, the director in there, for the trustees. It really lays out how these things work. But when you're in the middle of an adrenalized situation, is not necessarily the best time to absorb the specifics of a complex policy. So this is one to make sure that a board reviews on an annual basis. This is at the heart of what your library does. And that is the power. Now, actually, I'm going to go back to collection management policy just a little bit more. Adherence to this policy is what will save the day if there is a challenge. And I want to speak to one thing that I know is a fear, because there was at least one news report of it happening in another state. And if anyone wants to pop in a link to that news report, feel free. But fear that, that a librarian handling certain materials that a community member has identified as obscene could be arrested or threatened with criminal prosecution. I want to say this really important takeaway here in New York. in New York, if a librarian is handling material in a collection per a collection development policy, there is actually an exemption in the New York State penal law for any charge of obscenity. That is critical. That's why I put a little gold halo right around this collection development policy, because a librarian following this truly has a guardian from that type of fear, that there would be some type of criminal action based on an obscenity charge against that person personally, right? So very, very important thing. If there's no other reason to know that you have a collection policy and make sure it's and then your library makes sure it's being updated and followed, this would be the reason right there. Okay, so aside from the policy that governs what would be in the collection, right, and you can't have a content-based protest or challenge or petition for reconsideration unless you have content in there that got in there per the policy. There's some other critical documents that should be in a challenge or protest playbook, right? I'm a binder person, so I tend to like to organize things like my session right here in a binder, but it doesn't have to be. There's these fancy, drives and all sorts of repositories and things that I know all of you know how to do. But the point is to make sure that whoever's going to be leading and participating in the response to a particular type of protest, challenge, request for reconsideration, that they're all working from the same playbook. And that playbook starts with this: the charter, the bylaws, the plan of service, the library director job description, right? Because the library director is often going to have some critical functions to I can't think of a time when they wouldn't, right? Have critical functions and designated roles in handling some type of challenge. And again, sometimes the collection policy, is a one-all. Sometimes there's separate little policies that all operate together that have to do with, acquisition, weeding, things like that, right? So making sure all those are together. If your library or your district has a media policy, in other words, inquiries are coming in from the media, who is the spokesperson? That would be another important policy to have in this playbook. And then all of the policies governing conduct at the library, right? Patron code of conduct, visitor, etc. Because, small aside, you'll be shocked to know that I'm actually a big fan of protest. I'm a big First Amendment advocate. And to me, protesting is as American as apple pie, right? It's an important part of our country, and it's an important civil right, the right to protest. I think the concern here is, of course, not people exercising their First Amendment right, but doing so in a way that is bullying, intimidating, harassing, and potentially, if policies aren't followed, and if intellectual freedom isn't honored, the fear is that the opinion of one person will control what the community as a whole has access to, right? And if another wing of government helps that happen, that's censorship. So protest, good, right? But intimidation, harassment, quashing intellectual freedom, bad, right? So that's the balance here. So the tips in here, presume that, sometimes there's going to be, someone's going to file a request for reconsideration or express their concern about a book. And the situation might not rise to the level where you need to have a fully coordinated tactical response, because it's going to just happen. People are going to follow the rules and we'll be all set. As we know from looking at the media and the challenges that are happening, it's not the protest itself or the challenge itself that's the problem, right? It's the human interactions surrounding it. It's the pressure. It's what could be construed as bullying in some ways, right? That's what we're seeking to be able to address, counteract, while an orderly challenge is being handled. Any questions out there so far? Okay, so this is the playbook. This is a really good, if you have a student who wants to do some community service And this is a really good thing to have them compile, right? So this is a good volunteer task, if nothing else. So if you take a look at the session handout, it's the bigger part of the playbook, right? And let me just see where, okay. So the first thing, here we go, is now, is anybody going to be able to remember an actual acronym in the moment? Probably not. I wrote this and I'm still having trouble rattling it off, right? But the big thing is remain calm. You don't have to memorize the acronym. Don't let the fact that you don't remember the acronym in the moment make you nervous. The point is be calm. As a challenge starts to evolve, we're going to talk about the ways they evolve. That's where the scenarios are coming in, right? Whoever you happen to be, right? Frontline worker, volunteer, trustee, director, remaining calm, confirming that you hear them, right? I recognize your concern. It will be addressed. You're not telling them how it will be addressed, right? You're just saying it'll be addressed, right? Listening and listen. Don't apologize. Don't argue. If someone approaches you regarding a book that they have a concern with and they're very, very upset, your instinct, and this is actually a suggestion I got from someone, so thank you for helping me draw out this point. You can listen, you can say, I recognize your concern, I assure you it will be addressed, but that is not the time to apologize, explain, or to argue with them, right? Couple reasons. Number one, in the heat of the moment, sometimes people do say things that end up being evidence that could be used to their disadvantage later for a lot of reasons, especially if you're confronting someone who's being a bit hostile and maybe they're not bringing out the best in you that day. But also you don't want to oxygenate the situation. And these days we all have to be mindful, right? Is this being recorded? Is this being streamed, right? What's happening with the public relations part of this? And so by remaining calm, it helps with all of that, right? So there's a good legal reason to be calm, but it will help with all these other things as well. And you'll see as we get into the scenarios, I think you'll see a little bit more of that. And then the big one is manage the situation according to law and policy. And boy, have I packed a lot into that, right? Because depending on what the situation is, the way you manage it could simply be to say, I hear you're concerned. Thank you so much. Here's a comment place, here's our collection policy that, whatever, right? Whatever would work at the moment, make a little document of it and be done. Or if it becomes a very large situation, managing it according to law and policy could end up taking a lot of time and energy, right? And that's what the plan of the framework plan I've put together is designed to help you do. So, as I said, you have the playbook ready in advance. You make sure that people are at least familiar with it, right? Everybody who works at the library should know there's a collection policy. They don't have to be responsible for memorizing it or reviewing it or anything like that, but they need to know that it's there, and they need to know why it's so important to consistently resist attempts to censor materials. But having something, being ready to jump into a situation response plan in something like this is the way to reduce legal risk and stress. And so that is what's coming next. That's the worksheet that I have here. So if you take a look at page 2, starting on page 2 of the materials, it's just a quick worksheet, and it's designed to be portable to really any kind of organization. This is based on the situation of response for the National Incident Management System, which is the system that was developed in this country after 9/11, when a bunch of responding agencies showed up and couldn't play nicely together in handling how were they going to respond to the crisis, right? So you had a bunch of very powerful, used to being in charge people showing up and no system to organize it. And so this is a system, situation response approach was designed by that. I've stripped out a lot of the complicating factors and really just said, okay, when there's something when a protest or a challenge has evolved to the point where it's going to be a situation, right? A situation meaning this is a problem. And we know we have to handle it the right way. And we know it's going to take time and energy no matter what. And it's really important that we be coordinated and we model that we're following our policies, that we're managing it according to our policies. It's a way, this type of plan is a way to say, okay, how are we doing that? What's the goal and who's doing what, right? And I'll just walk through very quickly. And I will say I have used this approach with small libraries before, and it works very, very well. It's a very good way to organize people who are volunteers, right? Which means their time is limited, and you want them to have some joy in what they do as well, right? So this is a very handy way to organize, from your frontline workers to your director to your trustees. So just to walk you through, you sit down and you say, what is the goal of the library's response to this, and who's in charge of affecting our tactics? And I have to say, for a chartered library, so not for our school districts, for a chartered library, that's usually going to be the director, right? Because the director, the board makes policy, and the director is the one, or executive director is the person responsible for, affecting that policy, right? But in a situation where there's a challenge emerging and a protest emerging, where you want to, it's not just evaluating the challenge, but it's public relations. It's handling perhaps people who have, maybe you have workers who feel they've been subjected to some type of harassment or disrespect in the workplace, right? So the situation is bubbling. It positions a library to handle that as one thing, even as people are doing, right, all of the individual tasks as required by the policy. Because usually a challenge is first handled by the director. Although it can change from library to library. So if your library is different, that's perfectly okay. But so you want to have on your situation response team at least one board member who says, okay, yep, we got people protesting in front of the library. We got this Facebook page going. People are kind of situations getting to a certain boil. At least one board member or two are going to help out with this, right? So they get designated. You also want someone on the team who is just responsible for record keeping, right? For tracking what's happening in the social media, what's happening in the conventional media, what kind of a statement are we putting out? What's the timeline? Someone who's just paying attention to everything that's happening and keeping a consistent record that's accessible to the team so that they always know what they're responding to, rather than people saying, well, I heard this, or whatever, right? Having a very orderly response to the situation as it's growing, right? Again, sometimes situations don't get so elaborate that this full response is needed, but that can quickly change. So you can designate other members too. So if there's, so for instance, let's say you have a board liaison, or a board member who's also the liaison to the Friends, and you want to be able to keep the Friends somewhat in the loop, but not in the first level of response. Maybe putting that person on and making sure that they're letting the Friends know, so that if they're coordinating some type of advocacy, there's a way for them to be in the loop without actually being at the decision-making table. Because when a library or any organization needs to respond to any type of crisis, but particularly one with legal, mission, and public relations implications, as well as the impact it can just have on your employees, you want a small enough group that you can be nimble and you can make decisions fairly quickly. Then if you go on to page 4, if your library has regular legal counsel and things are getting to the level where things are starting to get into the news, it's starting to turn into a situation with a capital S, having that legal counsel at the table could be very, very helpful. If you're not at that stage yet, or there is no attorney available, designating someone who is a member of that situation response group to be the liaison to the legal counsel, to make sure you're getting timely input if and when it is needed. Making sure, so I even put it in as a little checklist item, do all the situation response team members have a copy of the playbook, right? So, and when you're pulling together your situation responders is not the time to pull together the playbook, right? The playbook already exists and they have access to it. And then you want to say, okay, what's the date, item 10 here, right? What's the date that the board convened this group? What's the date that either the executive committee of your board or your board itself said, whoa, this situation is turning into something bigger than just a simple paperwork driven challenge, right? This is turning into a media event, or it's having an impact on community relationships or anything like that, or really, really critically, and always something to pay attention to, is it having an impact on your employee well-being, your employee morale, the experience of working or being at the library, right? If that's the case, those are all good trigger points to say, we want an SRT to deal with this situation to make sure we can achieve the goal of resolving it, right, in a way that, in the way that we want to see it resolved. And then I have just some prompts, and every library, every district is going to have different, what I would call critical backup. Again, these are people who might not be a member of your SRT team who's making the calls in the moment, but critical backup. And obviously backup number one, item 12 here would be your, for our chartered libraries would be your library system. Because of course, they're going to have had some experience walking through, your fellow members in the system through, one storm or another, right? So making sure they're there and they have resources, and every system is different, but every system has those resources and is ready to help out in their own unique way. So making sure their director has been informed, and then really confirming what role are they able, willing, and desiring to play in this situation, right? So that there's clarity about that amongst your team, and your team can communicate that clarity to the full board of trustees, your friends, anybody else, right? If there has been any property damage in the situation, and I really hope that no one ever has to remember that I just said that, right? But or if there's a fear of, that it has impacted the experience of employees, critical backup might be your insurance carryout. Oh, and I see a question, maybe? No? Okay, I saw a hand. We'll see. Stop me if we get one. So critical backup might be the insurance carryout. Oh, Jill.
Cole, there was a question put in, what is an SRT?
Yes. So the SRT is the situation response team.
It's just the
Right.
acronym.
Yes,
for that.
thank you so much. Yep, I put, and
That was the question.
yep, your guide has all the acronyms and the names in there. So yes, thank you. That's exactly the kind of thing I need to make sure. I want to make sure this is all landing, because trust me, it seems like a lot, but it actually, you do this, I've seen it roll out very, very smoothly. So in some pretty hairy situations. So another critical backup is your friends group. Library directors out there, I know you understand the importance of good boundaries between your library and its operations and your friends, right? And making sure, the library is doing what the library does and the friends are doing what they do, and it's a beautiful and productive relationship. When you have a library challenge, most likely friends are going to want to help, and it's important to be able to let them know how to help. And I think advocacy techniques that's one of the topics that's going to be discussed at the ALA session next week. So how, right? What do you want your friends out there, saying and doing? But in this, it's really specifying that you've designated our friends are our allies in this, and one of us on this SRT, this situation response team, is going to reach out to them and say, you know what? We would really, really love it if 5 of you could be at this community meeting that's coming. Can we count on that, right? Or, whatever that is going to look like. Rather than inviting them to a big response meeting or sending out a ton of emails and everything, this, again, having a core structure and then having designated outreach to that critical backup, that next layer of support while you're responding to the situation. Another possible backup to think about, or you might get outreach from, would be a local arts, culture, or civil rights advocacy group. right? So you may get other calls saying, we want to help, we want to do this, we want to do that. You need to be ready for those things, and you need to be ready to either manage them if it can be a productive alliance, or to say, you know what, you do what you're going to do, the library is going to act according to its mission, right? So it'll help you draw that boundary and manage those things in a really timely way. And that's a call that is made by your situation response team, right? To say, okay, you know, what do we think? And then affected by the director or the leader, right? The leader, the person who's taking the lead on whatever the decisions are. Moving on to item 16, also possible backup could be a state or national group, right? Depending on how big the situation is getting. And being ready to work productively with those folks, because a lot of times those are the folks that come with money or can help you in getting the kind of attention that can aid in donations and issue awareness about the situation. So being ready to, again, have someone who is the designated contact point with that group. So if they do come and say, we do want to help, the help can be, first of all, you know, not coordinated with, but respectful of your library's unique response, right? Very, very important. So you want to be able to take on that assistance and work meaningfully with them.
Oh, could I, I'm sorry.
Please, no, yeah.
Someone has asked, is it advisable to have groups such as the Chamber of Commerce, Historical Society, etc., join in? Could you comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. So in this structure, that is additional backup, right? So your situation response team is probably your director, maybe 1 or 2 employees, 1 or 2 trustees. That's it. It's the bare minimum of people you need to take. You know, your trustees will be meeting and saying, okay, you know, here's our policies. This is how it, you know, this is what we want done, right? On a policy level, right? But the SRT is making that call. And then, yeah, any other local group, I would say, is that second layer of critical backup. And you should have your SRT should have designated, maybe, you know, all of this might be the library director, depending on the size of the library and the scope of the situation, right? If this is designed to, you can add team members or you can reduce team members based on what you need to do. It's partly to make sure that the handling of the response doesn't get overwhelmed, right? So what could be a 1 or 2 person job, if there's more media attention, if there's legal questions, if there's an information session that you want to get organized, if there's partners you want to outreach out to, it could become a 3 or 4 or 5 person job or even bigger, right? So being ready to add members to your SRT. But this approach is also a really, really good way to, you know, if you have a 5-member board of trustees or a 10-member board of trustees, it's a really good way for your trustees who are going to naturally be very concerned. And if you have any take charge personalities on your board of trustees, they're going to want to take charge. So when a library says, we've designated an SRT, right? We've designated a situation response team. They are handling this. There's a board liaison on that situation response team who will channel the input from the board. This is a very good way to avoid the kinds of meetings that aren't productive, but can be very argumentative, right? It's a very good way to make sure you're situated to be nimble, to comply with policy, to document that you're complying with the policy while you're thinking about all these other aspects as well. Again, this is if you end up having a challenge situation that gets media attention. So, and this structure is a really good way for a board to be reminded and be really respectful of the role of the director, the position of the employees, and the importance of the trustees as the leaders of the library on a policy basis, but not on a day-to-day basis. Those things can kind of erode once the pressure comes on and once a situation gets adrenalized. But at the same time, if the director is under attack, it positions the board to protect the director, right? Because you've got some trustees on the SRT, and maybe you're going to designate someone who isn't the director to be the spokesman or to be a co-spokesperson, right? So that they're not taking all the heat. very important to think about. Item 17 has this, it just reminds us that this is very much process driven, policy driven. If a formal challenge has been filed or a formal request for reconsideration or whatever it happens to be called under your policy, right, has been filed per the library's policy, what is the date it was filed, right? Just because that filing would be potentially at the center of everything else. And it certainly, the library needs to follow its process to the letter. But while that's happening, right, while that request for reconsideration is being evaluated, if it's appealed and maybe a board is then taking a look at it, all these other things are going to be managed according to the library's goal, its mission, and with an orderly plan. So.
Cole, could
Yes.
I interject with the question that someone submitted prior that I think might be a good time for? How do you deal with bad press in the social media when a patron's objection to a book is overturned by the library board of trustees, or just in general?
Oh,
how to handle bad press?
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. So to me, you can, I have never seen anyone get left hanging if they cite all of their media outreach in their ethics and their mission, right? So let's say, and I'm going to assume, meaning it was the request for reconsideration was overturned. So in other words, you might have, we can play it out either way, right? So maybe you have an unhappy community member whose request for reconsideration, was initially maybe they're happy, maybe they're unhappy, right? If the library has to issue some type of bad news, whether it's, we feel that we actually shouldn't have had this book in our collection, right? How do you own that? Or how do you own it the other way? It starts with the ethics and the mission, right? And so saying, it is the principle, it is an ethic of the library that we resist censorship, and we are here to provide information access, right? Serve the community, right? Put that in there. In that spirit, we have followed our policy, and we have determined the following, right? And then you put it out there, emphasizing that there is process, depending on what part of the state you're in, right? There's a emphasizing that there's a process, emphasizing that it's driven by ethics, emphasizing that it's undergirded by the law, I think is a good way to go. It also gives you, I have to say, a very boring statement, which is much less likely to get media attention than some grander rhetoric, right? Because I get excited about ethics, but most people don't. So once you start saying, look, the situation arose, we handled it according to our ethics, our charter and the law, and here was the resolution. A lot of people are only going to make it halfway through that sentence anyway. But nevertheless, it gives you a really legally sound, and I would say also an intellectually honest answer to that. However, that's the front-facing piece. So there's also the human element, right? And one of the things you'll see in the plan here is that someone is thinking about employee well-being, right? Or volunteer well-being, the well-being of the human beings who are being impacted by the situation, the workers. That has to be a part of the response. So if there are, whether there's going to be employee morale or relational challenges to whatever the resolution of the situation is, that needs to be factored in. There needs to be a plan for that before there is an announcement, before the decision is transmitted. If there's even a decision regarding employee disciplinary action, I don't know if that would happen, but if that's the case too, that needs to be considered. And that's another good role for an SRT, which at that point would say, wow, I don't know if they'd say wow, but they would say, on our situation response team, do we have someone who can help us with this human element, right? With the personnel related element, or do we need to bring in someone from the library system, or do we need to bring in some external backup on this piece, right? And so again, this structure is very flexible because it lets you do that. And It does it in a way that assures your board members, who might not be as involved, it's being handled, right? We have a situation team, we have a plan, we're keeping track, we've got everything locked down. So thank you. Yeah. So in addition to 17, where you're just making sure that if this is a formal challenge, right, a formal request for reconsideration, that's being tracked and you're just following the policy on that one. The situation response team isn't evaluating the request for reconsideration. It's being done exactly as required by the policy. And then really critical, what was the date the situation ended, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to take this when it's all over and put it in a drawer. And maybe someday you could even do a presentation on it, like how we got through the crisis or something like that. But, to every situation, there is an end, and saying, okay, situation's done, right? The situation response team is disbanded. It's all over. We're good, right? Response done. When a situation response is done, it's a really good practice if a board has the capacity to do this. And if a director wants to do this on the employee side as a development tool, that's very appropriate as well, is to take a look at the whole situation and say, okay, what did we learn? Do we need to change anything? Right? How can we learn from this? What can we take from this situation? Do we need to refine our policy or anything else? Okay.
Cole, can I chime in for a moment? For number 18, where you have add other items as situation evolves, and then 20, the after action, do you think that both of those are places where doing like personnel training is part of it? So that the active response includes like, maybe we need to have an extra staff meeting or things like that, and like planning pieces for prepping the personnel for immediate and long-term information that they would need to be aware of, and the things that we'll get into with the different situation scenarios.
Absolutely. Right. Thank you, Winnie. Yes, that's exactly. And it's a place to be a little flexible, because
be flexible.
Yeah, no library is like any other library, right? I mean, your communities are unique. The situation is going to be unique. For our smaller libraries out there, the person leading the protest may also be like the mom of one of your employees and, your neighbor, right? So it just gets very complex very quickly. And this type of approach helps the library be nimble, but also, and to act quickly and be accountable. But my advice in the plan, speaking of practice, is that, as you can see on the underline of this slide, you practice it before it is ever needed, right? So practice being challenged, practice being, protested. What does that look like? And that brings us to our scenarios. So we're going to run through some scenarios. And before we do that, I want to see if there's any other questions about this approach. And if, or just any practical challenges to this approach that anybody is feeling like, what do we do if we don't have a collection policy? I think you all have collection policies, but, what do I do if the principal of my school doesn't want to read my policy? I guess give them a copy of this and tell them why it's important. So, but trying to get that buy-in is important too. Any other questions?
We do have a few in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Jill.
let's take a look.
Yeah.
We have a couple popping up. So one of the first ones that's still in there is, should a library be insured to cover cost if they are sued over material content? So is insurance coverage, does that possibly extend to intellectual freedom lawsuits? So
you can buy insurance for just about anything. What's interesting is if let's say you have a challenge or a protest that is so disruptive, or perhaps it's leaving employees, maybe there's even a safety decision that the library is, going to beef up security, so it's coming with extra costs. So there are sometimes business interruption insurance, and then there is for certain kinds of claims that could be content related, the directors and officers insurance that most of your libraries will have, that will be covered. So, but that is a really important, so this is, there are insurance agents and then there are insurance agents. Insurance agents get a cut of, whatever premium a library is paying for their coverage. So this is a question to ask them, to say, here are the risks that the library is concerned about for the upcoming year. We weren't as concerned about this last year, but we're reading the trends, and we want to know, if our business gets interrupted or our costs go up, or there's any kind of claim related to content, what's the coverage look like, right? And make them get an answer for you, right? Or make the carrier give you an answer. And especially for those libraries that are getting their insurance through like a United Educators or a carrier that's used to sort of the theater around intellectual freedom issues, I'll call it that. They may have some interesting resources for you. So yeah, that was a good question. Do we have another one out there before we hit the scenarios?
We do have some others, but I think that we should get into the scenarios and then Jill and I can look through some of the questions and focus on those after.
Thank you. All right. We're going to start small here. All right. So a longtime patron sees a page who is a local high school student shelving a book with a theme the patron finds offensive. The patron says, "Who decided we should buy that book anyway? It's gross," right? And I call this the gathering protest. In other words, this person's not protesting. And they're certainly not filing any type of request for reconsideration or anything. It could be the sign of a gathering concern, or it could be an offhanded comment that this patron is going to forget that they said 15 minutes after they said it, and they've moved on, right? And this is where that remain calm part comes in, because training the page, and I always start with the page example because, as you know, I was a page at my local library, and I would get this kind of comment, right? And many other kinds of comments when I was working there. Now, granted, it was the 90s, times have changed, but some things are eternal. And just having the answer of, we have a collection management policy. That's how we decide to buy the books, right? That's how we build our collection. Being able to just say that in a really nice way, not being argumentative, right? And in this case, not even saying, "I'll pass your comment along," right? I mean, this is just someone casually voicing an opinion, could be a gathering thing, but it's very informal. And just having your frontline person ready to just, instead of ignore it, just say, "Well, we have a policy that governs how that's done. Now I'm getting back to work." That can be very, very helpful. So that's, our scenarios are going to escalate, and you'll see, right? So this one just starts with that first point, just be calm, and that'll carry you through this one. So that's scenario 2. A long-term patron sees a page who is a local high school student shelving a book with a theme the patron finds offensive. So same thing, but the patron says, "Who can I complain to about this gross book being on the shelves of my library?" Right? To me, that is moving into the informal stage, right? Because they're saying, who can I complain to, right? In other words, I want to make a complaint and I know it's to somebody, right? The answer is still, we have a policy for that. Here it is, right? And that's it. No arguing. Or if the person doesn't know, they can remain calm and say, "Let me find out," right? But it's really just, we have a policy for that. Here it is. And if people have suggested, other ways they phrase that, after over 20 years of practicing, I can't help it. I talk like a lawyer. So you can put, "Here's how a librarian would say that, Cole," right? And I would be delighted to hear your suggestions. So say long-term patrons, we got scenario 3. So this is still, I call this sort of like the gathering, right? So in other words, it's, you could get a sense of, oh, this could turn into something, but maybe it won't, right? And then this is, you'll see I start talking about scenarios as complicated. In other words, it's not just one kind of response that's merited. So a longtime patron sees that an author of a book in the collection the library will be presenting at the library The patron works with a few friends to organize a protest of the book. Fine, right? People protest, that's a civil right. Two of the protesters are the parents of the page, a high school student who's under 18. And at the protest, a reporter asks, and we'll say asks asks the parent, did you know your child would be exposed to this at their after school job, right? So suddenly, this is a gathering protest. Protest is it's healthy. It's a civil right. However, now it's kind of getting into this zone of, oh, protect the children. Did you know your child would be exposed to this content, right? It's still gathering. There's been no formal complaint, right? So this is going straight from we're concerned to getting on the media, right? I would say unless this is the least viewed cable access news station and it's not picking up in any way, once you have a complicated scenario, it's good to have a situation response team or a couple people designated to serve in that role, at least ready to give back up to the director, right? And deciding, and in that moment, it's just as important to decide which trustees are helping in an active way and which trustees are on backup reserve and certainly free to meet and opine and do work, but how are the shots being called in a really, really clear way that positions the library to be responsive. So scenario 4, we got the informal, right? So again, still no formal paperwork filed. You can do a lot of, you can get a lot done these days without filing formal paperwork, and it's all online, right? So we have a community member post in a local Facebook forum. I was at the library today and I saw an underage worker handling the most disgusting book, insert title, right? We're not picking on particular content. Who else is concerned? Sign my, and that should be petition, sign my petition at change.org, right? So this is an informal online. However, it's about to get complicated because this begs the question, should the library respond to this? Right? So it's on Facebook, it's the community, right? This is your community. And they've got something up on change.org, which means people from around the world could be asked to have influence and opine on things that are in the collection that's intended for your community. There is no one right way to respond to this, but I would say any library should make sure it develops a response that's informed by their mission and their ethics and their plan of service and the relationship that they have with their community, right? Some of this is going to be driven by, who is this forum? How big is it? How important is it to them that we immediately say, we are committed to intellectual freedom. We're committed to fulfilling our mission. Any concerns regarding content can follow our policy and then provide a link to the policy. Do you want to do that or do you not want to do that? There's arguments to be made on either one. What's important is to, no matter what, always drive these things back towards the policy. The public relations, the situation response team, all of that is to drive you back to using the policy to not only handle the situation in a way that complies with what you're required to do, but also educates the community, your community, about why you have a collection policy, about how these things are done. A lot of people don't understand, they don't see beneath the surface of how a library operates. And they don't know that there's regulations and standards and policies and all these things. And inviting them to learn that as part of their civic engagement on this, if you can keep calm and not take the yelling personally, right? This is why we practice these things. Can be very, it certainly could be helpful operationally, definitely will be helpful legally, because it will leave you with a record of always showing we have a policy, we let the public know we have a policy, we use the policy, right? That's how, and again, that protects your library staff in even the most serious situations. If anybody ever tries to say, well, this is obscene and I'm calling law enforcement.
Cole, this is something that we can come back to at this point, but I want to just bring it up right now in case you want to answer it. There's been a couple of questions in the Padlet and in the Q&A about when people internally aren't following the policy. It seems like this is especially a trend at school libraries where there's a principal or a superintendent that hasn't had the same training in intellectual freedom that library professionals have. So yeah, if the policy, if certain people that are responding to the situation want to follow it, but others that have authority aren't. Do you want to speak to that now or wait till the end?
No, I'll speak to that one right now because it's an interesting question. And again, a tactical plan is only as good as its implementation, right? And yeah, this is where in any of these situations, leadership needs to be ready to lead effectively. And I've worked with many varieties of administrator and leader, and there are different ways to get them to hear about risk and ethics that aren't in their primary lane of work, right? So, it's almost psychological. You have to figure out what makes them tick. So for one type of leader, I've found it's enough to simply say, these are the ethics that inform all libraries nationally and throughout our state. It's embedded in the education law. It's part of, being an education professional to know this, right? You don't need to know everything, but I'm going to give you this one guide sheet that's going to tell you everything you need to know, and it's going to make you a much better administrator. I would teach them even in the face of a challenge, number one rule is be calm, acknowledge it, right? Listen, and then follow the policy. And an administrator wants to hear that because they'll say, okay, I'm going to manage this according to law and policy. They need to know there's law and policy to manage it by. Otherwise, they could make a knee-jerk reaction and make a decision that's based out of either fear or expediency or ignorance. So that's technique number one would be the play to the you're such an accomplished administrator. I know you want to know this. Here's the latest, right? Here's how you show it. The other way is to get to the lawyers. I do think it's a really interesting tidbit to pass along to, not every attorney who's an education attorney, is attuned to library issues, just the way, I'm a business attorney, but I'm not attuned to all business issues, right? People have their areas that they look at. It's a really interesting tidbit to tell a lawyer, did you know that we have a collection policy and there's an exception in the obscenity law as long as we're following it? And no lawyer ever, I guarantee you, they'll probably go, oh yes, I remember that. They really don't, right? But no lawyer wants to be caught, not knowing something about the law that their client knows. So mentioning that, because a lawyer is another way to get to an administrator, because if the lawyer is going to advise, okay, here's how we have to handle this, it's really, really important, right? So that's another entry point. And the other entry point is just good old fashioned development. But honestly, education is so regulated in the state of New York. There's so many mandates, so many things that the administrators need to learn. I think anything that gives them some shorthand to get there, like an acronym and a statement of ethics, right? Give them 2 of the slides, and that might be very effective. But and repetition. You have once a year, no less, finding a way to remind them. It's really, really important. I worked with a librarian once who, he was so good at that. And at one point I was just like, man, okay, I heard you, but you know what? To this day, it's top of mind. So I think, polite, firm repetition, or whatever your communication style is. So yeah, thank you. Yeah. All right, we'll do scenario 5 and then see if there's questions as well. So a longtime patron sees a page who's a local high school student shelving the book. Oh wait, this is the informal in person. We're going to skip this one because we've kind of covered that, and we're getting to the point where we want to be able to ask more questions. So I felt bad when I envisioned this one, right? Director is enjoying dinner after a busy day with their husband and says, their husband says, I should probably wait until after you eat to show you this, but I know you'll want to see it. And following a Facebook link to change.org, is the page asking for signatures of support. There's a link to a document with a challenge or a request for reconsideration per the library's formal challenge policy, right? So this is rising into the complicated zone because there's this public aspect, but now, depending on how your policy functions, right? How does a challenge form or a request for reconsideration form need to be submitted in order to kick off action under the policy, right? This is really, really important. But at the same time, this is also turning into just an issue, if not a capital S situation. So here we have a scenario 7. It's a formal in-person scenario. So a trio, right? So people are gathering now. They've gathered. A trio of patrons asks for an impromptu meeting with the director to talk about how books are chosen. And when told they will have to schedule a meeting, they say, just give us the complaint form. And they fill the request for reconsideration form out right there. And they say, just give this to the director. Now, there's a lot going on here, or a lot that could be going on here. I would say, it's funny, you want to remain calm. You want to make sure that you're non-reactive, but anytime there's an opportunity to say, how are the books chosen? How is the collection built? How do we pick our movies, our music, all of the things that are available to you? There is a policy for that. Here it is, right? Anytime, these are educational opportunities. They can also be harassing, scary, adrenalizing, off-putting, and all these other things. But a member of a community coming out and saying, who does this? Who picks this? I'm so concerned. It's a chance to showcase how libraries work, how grounded they are in the law, how careful they are, and how they are truly, the collection process is designed to aggregate content that reflects the needs of the community, which the people, whether it's a trio or one person or 20 people, bringing forward a concern might not be aware of, right? So it's a chance to inform them of needs in their own community that they might not be aware of or might be dismissive of, for that matter, right? This is certainly happening, where there's content that reflects the needs and experiences of people who have been underrepresented in collections. And so that's how you stop a collection concern from becoming a culture war, because you want it to stay a collection concern. So I would say, if people have the training to do it, if people have if the moment is polite and civil enough that engagement can happen, to engage and say, here's how the books are chosen. I do think that that's an important thing to do if the person has again, the training and the comfort level saying that in the moment, right? So scenario 7. And that's, these scenarios are here for a library to take. The content is going to be licensed for any of you to use, anybody who wasn't able to attend today, but more importantly, for you to go through the slide deck and the guide with your trustees, leadership, and frontline folks, and even front-facing volunteers to run through these, to talk through, just as I am doing now, right, with your own ears. How would we handle this, right? What would it, what would inform the discussion? And particularly, you'd be doing that in the context of your own community, right? How this would be handled in one library is going to be very different from another. All right. So scenario 8, formal, complicated. A patron files a formal challenge, but when informed by the director of how the process will proceed, says, that's not fast enough. This book is hurting babies right now. I am calling my son at the PD to arrest you, you smut peddler. Whereupon she places the call, because she's got a cell phone and, she's doing that right now. And maybe her friend is there, streaming this action while this is happening, right? So number 1, small sidebar, I did just do a guide for the Pioneer Library System on how to deal with aggressive requests to record in your library. So if part of you is saying, oh my goodness, she just threw in this recording thing, how would we handle that? You can take a look at that. Talk to Ron Kursop at Pioneer. It was a real pleasure to work with him on that because it has some ideas of how to de-escalate recording, because recording can happen in libraries, but at the same time, it has to happen in a way that doesn't disrupt operations, or for that matter, run the risk of jeopardizing the confidentiality of the patrons who are using the library at the time. So that was a little sidebar. But for this piece, so number one, there is an exception in the law, in the penal law in the state of New York. But if someone is threatening to arrest, or to call the police or anything like that, this would be a good time, if the library has a lawyer, to get the lawyer on the phone, and whoever you have to get through to get to the lawyer, you say, this is a code red situation, right? That can be very, very helpful to have someone. Most likely, if you have PD who know what they're doing, they might get the call. They might come to mediate a dispute, or they might show up, but because of the way the law works, nothing should happen. Of course, not all responding officers are trained in the finer details of the New York State obscenity law. So this is a deep, deep worst case scenario. I found no case law like this in the state of New York. If anyone is aware of a librarian having been arrested for obscenity in the last 10 years, I would appreciate you popping the report of that into the chat. I found nothing on LexisNexis, but that's I only get something from that if it's been reduced to some type of legal opinion from a judge, usually. So please let us know. But I put this in to really not to make you feel fearful, but actually to build confidence, to say, even if this happens, as long as you keep cool and don't engage in anything that could be construed as harassment, right? It should not be, there's an exception for you and you should be protected. So just putting that out there. But that said, even if that's true, I have to say this right here is what you call a complicated situation. And I think it would be good for an SRT, even if it's just 3 people, to say, okay, who's supporting our director? How are we messaging this? And how are we keeping an eye on this situation, right? How are we tracking the record? Right there, very, very important. All right, scenario 9. And I'm looking at the clock, it's 2:16. So at a local school board meeting, a community member takes the microphone to say, I am sorry to say that not only do we have to watch out for obscenity at the local library, but right here in the elementary school too. I suggest we form a parent book review committee to review the purchase list before our hard-earned tax dollars buy another book. If a board member doesn't support this, we will vote you out. All right, so put that on as the ultimate informal, complicated situation, right? There's no complaint pending, right? No request for reconsideration. You don't know where, maybe you don't even know where this is coming from, but here this is happening. This is one to say, what do we want to put, how much traction is this getting? What do we want to do to respond, right? And maybe you even have someone who responds in the moment and is able to say, we already have, a process that reviews the content, but maybe not. Right? Maybe to leave that one alone and not poke it might also be good. Those are calls in the moment. So here's our bonus scenario. So after any one of these scenarios, a challenger asks for a digital or printed list of every book in your library. For those of you in school districts, and this is a scenario that was suggested to me, by the way. I think it's drawn from it might be more than hypothetical. So in theory, or not in theory, in reality, this type of request for all but our association libraries, this content would be subject to FOIL. So they could FOIL this, and it would be depending on how your catalog is kept, it would be a very interesting request to fulfill, right? But when ever a library is hit with what could be a Freedom of Information Law request, right, which is a request for public documents if they're not exempted from disclosure under New York State Freedom of Information Law, the response is, we've received your request and we will let you know within 5 days, right? And that's about it. So that's part of that calm, is when a FOIL request is received, you have 5 business days to respond, just to say we got it and we can or cannot fulfill it. And then there's time after that. So that's another one where someone might ask this question in a rather adrenalizing or aggressive way. Stay calm, say, we've received your request, we've heard it. It will be handled per law and policy, and we will get back to you. And that's it. So, questions?
Cole, I think it's a good time, since you're just talking about the school board. There's been a lot of questions specific to schools, K through 12, BOCES related, challenges from parents, rights of parents and students. And can you, I know that's a lot to talk about. Can you just kind of touch on that, on the context of K through 12 and rights of parents and students, and, you know, more specifically?
Yes, absolutely. So in the K through 12 realm, this issue is also bumping up against another trend that we have been experiencing throughout the state, here where I'm at in Western New York as well, which is, I guess I'll call them diplomatically, contentious school board meetings, right? So, you know, citizenry has been activated. People are paying attention to education issues. Parent groups are forming. You know, some of it is motivated by concerns, you know, just regarding pandemic response, right? But it's all over the place. And I think, you know, the first important thing is to really know the policies. I know I sound like a broken record on that, but having those policies on hand, and then really taking stock of your environment and making sure that the allies that you will need in the moment are aware of the policies. And if they're not, or if they're not ready to handle a challenge in a way that stands up for intellectual freedom and is respectful of the way things are supposed to be done per the policy, finding a way using one of the tactics or your own custom tactic to make sure that person develops that competency. I do think that I'd like to think this, but I don't know if it will be the case. This is something that a union, if a teacher is in a union or a professional is in a union, you know, this type of awareness and having the backs of the teachers and the librarians, you know, is important. It's something for a union to advocate for as well, to say administration will do the following. However, that's a very idealistic view of what union relations can be used for. So I suggest it, and if you have the right union reps, it really could happen. But in general, I think it's remaining calm, but cultivating those allies and asking your district, you know, when we have this, what is the response plan? Not all districts, this model here is portable to a school district as well. Most school districts certainly have emergency response plans, and they should be very familiar with this kind of model. It's really the bottom line on this is letting everybody know and making sure people are living up to that this is an ethical issue in education. It's a legal and regulatory issue. This can't be a political issue. How your library collection or your curriculum materials are brought together, it's not accidental. It's created by a combination of law, you know, regulation and policy, and that needs to be honored. But again, I say this saying, I know it's tough on the ground to sometimes make those connections or build those alliances or make sure that training happens. But I think showing a small document, relatively small document like this, saying this is how important this is, right? Could be a good first step in that. Next question. Do we have any others out there? I'm tempted to look at the chat, but I'll get distracted. Yes.
How about if the challenge is coming from within? If a librarian is deeming material pornographic.
Oh my.
It's not coming from outside, but it's coming from a librarian.
Coming from, the call is coming from inside the house.
Exactly. That's the question.
Yeah, I'm sorry for it. Yeah, maybe not everyone got that reference. I think it's a good old urban legend, right? So, so if it's coming from, so that's a really, when I talked about making sure your response is analyzing the situation and you're taking all the steps you need to do, that you need to take. So if the content is inappropriate for the, so let's say a decision is made that, yeah, you know what, we've thought about it. This content was not what our library is about. It doesn't belong in our collection. We've applied our criteria and we're going to honor that. That is separate from the consideration, which is that if someone is exposed to material or content or communications at work that they are finding creates a hostile environment, nowadays, of course, that's actionable under a sexual harassment policy, right? However, if material entered a library per a collection policy, even if it leaves per a collection policy, right? In other words, it was, reconsidered, and for whatever reason, it was decided, yep, we're going to phase this one out. We're going to take it out. The fact that it was put in properly, even if there's a decision to change that, means that working with that material is part of your job. So, and to put it in a different context, here at my office, we help people in a variety of issues here. And sometimes my staff is exposed to content that I would rather they didn't have to be exposed to, right? And that can be, it can be painful, it can be stressful, but they're doing it in the context of their job. We're handling it according to the ethics of my profession. It's not creating a hostile environment, right? Because it's part of the work we do, and it's properly part of the work we do, right? So that's why, again, the adherence to policy. And I remember the question that was asked earlier of, well, what if our library isn't following our policy? I mean, that's just a red flag. I could say a lot on that, but the bottom line on that is if your library is not following the collection policy, it needs to start. That is a risk management issue. It's a huge risk. The policies have to be followed. If they're not being followed because they're out of date, they need to be updated. As you all probably know, New York State education law regulations were updated so that all library policies need to be revisited at least once every 5 years, right? So that's a change in library regulations. That's key, right? Keeping things current. So either update it so you can follow it, or recognize it's okay and start following it. And again, easy to say, perhaps hard to do, but it has to be done. Any other questions? Oh, it's 2:27.
There's a lot. Cole, I apologize to everyone who submitted questions before this, but I just quickly wanted to bring up the last question that came in. You mentioned earlier the New York law that exempts librarians. Could you possibly get out a citation for that, just for future reference?
I can't do it off the top of my, I was gonna have it in a slide actually, and then the slides got long. So I will send out an update of the materials with the citation. Absolutely, yes. And then I'm gonna look at the chat unless anyone wants to throw out some more questions.
There's a lot of discussion about the unions and FOIL. That's just, you can't just cover that in a couple minutes, but.
So I like this. So I'm going to look at chat now, and please direct me if I'm, not looking in the right place here, but should we do more to make the public aware that libraries don't promote censorship? I think the more a library, and I imagine this is clear from what I've said, but taking a page out of my friend's book back in the day, I'll repeat it. I think the more libraries can do to educate the public that collection development is intentional, is driven by policy, is thoughtful, right? The more a library can do to make the public aware of that, the better, because people simply do not know that. I think they just envision that, at this, a librarian just visits Amazon and just clicks some books that they like, right? So the more that you can say, we support intellectual freedom, we resist censorship, and we follow policy in collection development, right? That's the trifecta right there. We resist censorship, we support intellectual freedom, and we follow our policies when it comes to managing our collections, right? Whether it's bringing books in or deaccessioning, weeding, or removing things from a collection. Yeah. Any other questions out there that are trending? I see one I want to answer. So I'm going to pick, and then I'll ask either Jill or Whitney to pick. If a principal or administrator asks the librarian who has this book, we do not have to tell, correct? Library privacy. Yes. Okay. So CPLR, this civil, this one I can recite the citation. So section 4509 of New York Civil Practice Law and Rules is what bars giving library information, including school library, meaning academic libraries at institutions of higher education and school districts, bars giving library information to third parties. Now, most schools get around this one way or another. Some schools have decided to interpret that FERPA would allow parents to have access to that information. I am not on that, that's not how I interpret the law, but I didn't ask the lawyer on this. It's open to interpretation at this point. So some schools have done that. Others have set it up so that, the use of the library, part of the operations of the library are to have that information shared. But in general, my answer is, number one, this is correct, right? You do not have to tell, you shouldn't tell. And the default should be no information going out, right? However, the exception in the law says that a library can share that information for operational needs. So for instance, if I go to my local library, I check something out so that I was there, and while I'm there, I vandalize the place, right? So suddenly my library needs to file a police report about me and all of that. They can use the fact that I was there. They can share the fact that I was there with the police report for purposes of, meeting the operational needs of the library. This is how like third-party collection agencies can be given information about library fines, right? If places are still levying fines and using third parties to collect on them. So let's see. I understand the need to keep reading. Oh, go ahead. No, I promise to let you go. Go ahead, Whitney.
I think we're looking at the same one from Alex. I understand the need to keep formal notes about how the process unfolds, but I heard a tip recently that when just informally discussing the situation with your response team, it's better to do it over the phone or in person and avoid putting things down in text form. The idea is that we don't want the informal off-the-cuff things we say being susceptible to requests for information. Is that a good tip, or is there any reason why that's legally hinky?
No, it's legally hunky-dory, actually. I got to use hunky-dory. But I want to break it down a little bit more. So if the situation emerges in a way where the library immediately identifies legal risks. So for instance, let's say one of your folks, forgot to remain calm and maybe said some things in the moment that are, being subject, there may be a complaint about their performance or even a complaint to law enforcement, not related to obscenity or anything, but saying, this person harassed me, threatened me, something like that, whether it's, maybe it didn't even happen that way, but the person is reporting, the complainant is reporting it that way. If there was property damage, if there's trespass, all of those things, if the situation response team calls in an attorney to be a member of the team or is emailing that attorney for purposes of getting legal advice about the situation, all of that back and forth, if done properly, and your attorney will acquaint you a little bit more with the mechanics of how to do that, all of that can be subject to attorney-client privilege, which means it does not have to be handed over per a FOIL request, right? And it's actually at that point, it will be important to have that written down. So that's number one. Number two, when I mention, the person who's keeping the record, what I'm really thinking of in that is the external record. In other words, who's out there taking, I'm sure most of you have now handled a situation where you had to look at multiple sequential screen caps, right? Everybody screen caps everything nowadays. So who's getting the screen caps? Who's handling all of that, right? So you're not creating new, you're gathering things that already exist for purposes of being able to monitor the situation and respond properly. I think you have to be able to do that. I absolutely endorse that, as I like to say, there's a time to pick up the phone, there's a time to email. The time to pick up the phone is when you need to discuss things, right? Especially if they're really, really sensitive, especially if you don't have the attorney as part of the discussion, right? That should be happening verbally, absolutely. Once you reach a decision and part of the decision is to affect legal compliance, that's when to write something down, because that proves, so if somebody has to be, let's say one of the protesters, hasn't been able to conduct themselves without harassing people or being disruptive. And so now they have to be told, look, you can't be on the premises of the library under our, visitor rules, code of conduct, what have you, right? The discussion, you want to have the discussion and not go back and forth, especially without attorney-client privilege, but definitely documenting that final decision. And I have a feeling that when Alex asked that question, that he knew that, but I just wanted to draw that out, right? There's definitely a time to talk, definitely a time to write things down in an orderly way. Yeah. Can you read the question about the SRT being a longstanding team, Whitney?
Okay. So I was envisioning the SRT to be a long-standing team that's prepared for challenges and doesn't dissolve after a specific situation ends. Could that work too? Or is it better to form a new SRT for every situation?
And so this was asked by an anonymous attendee. So I will say, anonymous attendee, if every client I have and if every board of every not-for-profit could have a standing situation response team that was trained and ready when these things happen, and kind of knows the language and knows what to do, that would be amazing. And then the way you would manage it is you would handle things by situation. So once the board declared, right, this informal, complicated protest has become a situation with a capital S, mobilize the SRT, right? So SRT hops into gear, gets the goal from the board, right? And then works to make it happen. And then as soon as it can say, okay, this situation is done, goes dormant again. That is the sweet spot. Yep, absolutely. I was really into that question. Sorry, go ahead.
So I have a follow-up to that. So ideally, there's an SRT plan in place that can be activated as needed, and even better if there's already kind of an assigned group that are like ready to be part of the SRT when a goal is identified by the board to handle a situation. But what if the situation has already been rolling and only one person at the institution wants to enact a situation response team and they haven't really had that plan in place yet? Do you think there's ever a time where it's too late in a situation for someone that works at the institution to request to the administrators and the board, hey, can you take a look at these presentation materials from this presentation I attended with attorney Cole Adams, in December 2021? Is this something that we could apply to this situation, even if it's been something that's happening at their place for an extended period of time already?
Oh, yes. Okay. And I want to say, I know Jean Curry is raising her hand, so I want to go to Jean next. So Yes. So one of the things that happens, right, is a situation suddenly can become a situation, but it can be evolving for a very long time and be very manageable, right? So, to take this out of the realm of protests and content and all that, let's just think about a leaky toilet, because I've heard at least one of my librarian friends out there has said, wow, I didn't realize plunging the toilet was going to be part of my duties was I was made a director. But of course, it's all hands on deck for a lot of things. And so let's say there's, you got the leaky toilet or it needs plunging, and you know what, it's getting done. That can be happening. But then what about the day the leaky toilet turns into the burst pipe? And then the day the burst pipe turns into a complete and utter flood, right, causing a mold hazard. Somewhere between the leaky toilet and the mold hazard, that turned into a situation in my world, because you're talking to insurance carriers, you're dealing with health concerns, you're dealing with possibly even finger pointing in the community about why was the pipe allowed to happen, all of that kind of stuff. So yes, pulling, saying, okay, finally, this is serious enough. We're gonna mobilize the SRT, have them handle this, then demobilize, right? Yeah, absolutely. And it can happen at any time. Yeah, absolutely. And now I do want to see if Jean wants to pop in, because if that's okay, can we see what she wants?
Jean, you can talk. I think you're on.
There we go. I'm sorry. Is that okay now?
Yep.
I made a mistake and I didn't mean to put my hand up. I'm sorry. I don't have any questions. This has been great.
Oh,
Thank you.
Well, and then I'll just think you were waving to me, and I will wave.
Right. There you go.
All right. So let's see here. So yes, and just and I just want to going back to that question on the SRT being a longstanding team. So as I mentioned, this approach is a very, very pared down approach that's informed by the National Incident Management System. And anybody who has trained for an all hazards response team, at perhaps an institution of higher education or at a school, this would sound a little familiar if you've done any all hazards response or hazard response work. So, and it's drawn from that. And actually, this will interface really well if you're ever so unfortunate as to have a large law enforcement or fire or any type of federal, government agency response, either at your library or around your library. This will actually help your board interface with the law enforcement on site, because this is based on the system they use to organize themselves when they're on the ground responding to multiple car accidents, fire, whatever could be impacting the area around your library. So if anybody needs to sell, maybe you could get some folks, trustees, and I understand, because it always seems like trustees are getting handed a new mandate, a new regulation they have to follow, right? It's there's always these new things coming down the pike. So if they say, well, this protest thing is a flash in the pan, we're going to weather it. We don't need to, do this whole, 14-page guide to handle that. This is a useful approach for a lot of other things as well, right? And it really, really helps the board be thinking about the people who are going to be impacted on the ground in the response. And it also helps coordinate with all of the different compliance aspects that you might be juggling if the situation gets complicated. So let's see. Jill, can you read the question from Nancy Russell?
Yes. What if a board member or several members do not agree with the collection development policy and do not support the SRT?
Okay, well, this is going to sound flippant, but I would be happy to talk to them. So, but maybe I'm not so persuasive. I don't know. I mean, this is the collection policy, right? Is job one for your board. And so, and this is the kind of thing, this is the reason the state was considering mandating board training, because library trustees, it can't just be that they love books, right? They have to commit to learning the lay of the land, learning, what type of legal entity it is that they're responsible for. What are the ethics that govern it, and what are the policies that help them live up to those ethics? So I would say it's finding a way to make sure that that's understood. I mean, in the most extreme situation, that's something that would even catch the attention of the regents. But now, on the other hand, the other part of that question was, do not support, having a situation response team. This is just this is just one approach, right? So boards can navigate crises many, many different ways. The important thing is to remember that you have to take care of your people and your community first, people first, right? You have to follow your policies. You have to respect the natural organizational flow of a library, which means that actions are going to be taken, either taken or dictated by the director. But at a certain point, if things are getting very, very bad or complicated, the director is going to need backup. And there's a number of ways to do that. This is just one way on the SRT part. Collection development policy, that's they can call it whatever they want, and there's going to be different approaches to it, but you have to have that. You have to have that one. Non-negotiable. Next question.
Sarah asked, should there be a written statement that is available to all library staff to be sure the same message is being shared with the public?
I think that's a great idea. Again, and there's a number of ways. So I've suggested having, a once a year training where the trustees and the director, the management and the staff run through this together. I have observed in my work that there is often a disconnect between volunteers, frontline workers, management, and trustees. And that makes sense because they're all there to play very, very different roles, and they operate with different pressures, and they have different perspectives on the organization. Because of how a challenge or protest can evolve, this is one of the things. I would say my pipe example or natural disaster example is another one, right? This is one where they all need to be working from the same playbook and coordinated. And if not seeing the situation the same way, at least being able to appreciate each other's experience and everybody acting in a concerted manner. And so that's why, I'm promoting having people gather and review the scenarios slowly and talk through questions and anxieties, and maybe even learn through asking each other more questions than coming up with answers, right? However, another good way definitely would be having just a sheet of takeaways, right? And I can think of 50 other takeaways I would want. I would have loved to have known when I was a page at a library, right? That were just boom, 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 boom. I know I got some of them when I was there. Some of them I learned, only later. It was like, oh, that makes sense, right? So, but yes, I think that's another way to do it, is to just have a one pager, but make sure everybody's looking at it. Can we tackle the one about the union? Jill, can you read the one from Janet on the Friends group?
Yes, we do not have a Friends group, but we have a union. At what point does the union need to get involved?
Oh, so you probably can guess this. I am a very, I work for employers, but I'm very labor friendly, I guess you would say it. So I can hear some labor law attorneys I know screaming in my ear right now, right, of how to answer this question. So I do want to put a little disclaimer for those of you who are working with, a professional, if there's a union and you have an attorney, check in with them on this question. Don't just do what I'm about to say. Personally, I think the sooner you're checking in with the union to say, this is happening, we're all here for the same mission, and we're all committed to the same ethics. We're committed to the well-being of the workers who might get impacted by this situation. We need you to give us information and feedback about how this is evolving, so we can consider, the perspective of the people that you represent, right? When I take that approach, I get one of three reactions, which is either thank you, which is of course my favorite reaction, and then we all work towards, making good things happen, hopefully, right? Sometimes I get a reaction of, what, right? Because they don't trust, if there's a tense employer-employee dynamic, right? Labor management dynamic, what could be a positive overture is sometimes not taken that way. And that's just, we move at the speed of trust. And sometimes that can't happen. And sometimes it's just rejected, right? But I do think if you put, ethics, mission, and people right up there, right? I mean, you don't have, there's no reason for the ethics, and there is no mission if you don't have the people. So, if there's a positive relationship with the union and it can be used as additional input for, what might be helpful, I think that's really, really good. I just want to absolutely stress, I'm bookending it, right, for purposes of the recording. I just want to stress, if you're in a union environment and there is an attorney for the district or the library or the system or whatever, getting that lawyer involved, because they might be sensitive to some other dynamics and aspects of the contract that would inform how you did the outreach. But yes, I think it's an all hands on deck situation, right? But the union rep isn't necessarily on the SRT, but you definitely would want someone, if the relationship opens up, you'd want your situation response team to have an open line of communication to them to solicit and get that feedback. And then hopefully it can be a positive and cooperative relationship, hopefully. So, and let's see, I'm gonna read Whitney, can you read this one that came up about the academic libraries?
Are we in the Q&A or in the chat? I'm sorry.
In the chat. I'm looking at the chat. Yeah.
Okay. From Christina.
No, it's let's see, it looks like it's the
Let's see.
second to last one.
Second to last one.
How, if at all?
Cole, do you just want to read it if you're looking at it? I'm sorry.
How, if at all, would you adapt this advice for academic libraries? Our institutions have a board of trustees, but they don't usually approve our policies. Oh, right. And it's interesting because I said, and I'm going to hold it, I'm not giving examples of the maybe political slant or the types of materials that are ending up as the focal points of these challenges. But in academia, let's just say the experience is going to be a little bit different, right? As this question points out. So your academic, so a library at a higher ed institution is still going to have, and I know you know this, anonymous attendee who asked this question, are still going to have policies, still going to have collection policies. And the entity that's reviewing those policies, among other places, is going to be the accreditor of your institution, right? So higher ed accreditors pay a lot of attention to the library. What are the library's policies? What kind of collection does it have? Does it have archives? How are the students being served by the library? What databases does it get? All those things, right? And to really pass an accreditation review with flying colors, the library needs to be, up to snuff. And I would say, if there are any concerns with either maybe a collection policy isn't as robust as it should be, maybe it's never been formally adopted by the institution, maybe it's always been sort of dictated just by practice. Having one or enhancing it and working with, usually the library is going to be, every higher ed institution is a little bit different, but usually the library falls under the academic arm, right? It's not under the administrative wing. It's usually under the VP for academic affairs, the provost, whatever it's called at that institution. Mm-hmm. And making sure that they understand how the collection policies and the other policies of the library play into academic freedom, which is a commitment that the faculty are going to want to see supported in every area of a college or university. So the way I would adapt the advice is have a collection policy, right? So if there hasn't been one, or if it hasn't been approved, find someone in that chain of authority to say, whether it went to the accreditors, and you can say it that way, or it was looked at and by an academic senate and it was confirmed, right? Or they received it and they endorsed it, right? Because maybe the director of libraries, maybe it's entirely their purview, and so they don't need any other approval, right? So you find a way to make sure the policy is viewed as legitimate, and then you start, again, building this awareness. And the librarian I told you about who, taught me through repetition, that was when I worked in higher ed. And it was because sometimes these things are a little less formal in higher education, especially private institutions, that it was so critical that he did that. And so, know what they are, and then make sure that the people with authority are aware of it and are aware of the ethical and legal underpinnings, which there are slightly different. There's going to be slightly different ones, but than the ones we were cited here, but they're still there, and they're still there to be cited. Let's see. All right, 254. Let's see. I'm just going to read this last one, and then we're going to talk about this next week's presentation by the ALA. Trying to interest higher ups in these procedures. Do you have any other suggestions? Oh, and yes, and Lucy Miller, wait on the question to the end. Okay, so selling this, it really is selling these kinds of things. It really does depend on what are the pressure points of the person that you're working with. Because they hugely mitigate risk. If you are working with a higher up, an administrator, a trustee, whomever, who is very aware of compliance, then you say, well, this is an essential policy for our compliance, right? And having an approach like this will mitigate our risk. Those are some buzzwords for people who approach their duties as leaders or fiduciaries seriously, from the legal perspective, right? It mitigates risk. It's a compliance issue, right? For if you have a leader or a higher up who tends to lead more emotionally or charismatically, I'd say you make it about people, and you say, getting on the same page about this is how we make sure that our people who are out there, bearing the brunt of the challenges are being supported, and that they have confidence, and that they know we have their back, and we can protect the reputation of the institution. Another good way to do it is if the person is more, if they're responsible for fundraising, would be to say, look, if we get a challenge like this and it picks up on media traction, it's also a great chance to get donations into the Friends, into the library, and to raise awareness about our mission, right? So, you find what makes that person tick. And try to give it to them in their language from their perspective. So I do want to talk about, I don't know if we were going to have a couple folks from ALA here, but I do want to share that they have something coming up. Can you see that on the screen? I've got my chat up, but you can. Yes, good. So this is something, so if as I've been talking, you say, okay, well, we've got our SRT, our situation response team is ready. We're ready to deal with this calmly. We have our playbook assembled, but now our friends want to help. Now some community groups want to help, and we need help with advocacy. What do we do? That's this session coming up next week. And it looks like we do have Deborah. Are you there?
I am here, Cole.
Hello, Deborah. Please tell us about the session for next week.
It's going to expand on your session. You did really wonderful work in talking about scenarios and things like that. Teresa Camara, the General Counsel for the Freedom to Read Foundation, will be one of the presenters, and she'll be doing a thorough review of the laws, the case law and statutes regarding book censorship, illegal content, i.e. obscenity, and how that impacts libraries of all types. I'll be doing a review of some of the more contentious challenges and legislative issues we're seeing crop up across the country. And then Megan Kusick, who is ALA's Assistant Director of State and Local Advocacy, will talk about how library workers can make a positive impact both at on legislation and on local challenges, both in their own libraries and libraries in their communities. And so it'll be a great resource. We're trying to provide a kind of toolkit for both librarians and community members who want to address this trend toward censoring books that we're seeing in many communities across the country. And we'll be really looking forward to having everyone join us. And please go to the link and get more information and come be part of our program.
And thank you so much. I know ALA really has just been flagging all these things nationally. It's been really, it's been making me be very thoughtful to see what's happening in the rest of the country while we're here in New York. So I'm just so grateful you could join us, and grateful you could let us know what, what's happening nationally on this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, not a problem. I did add a few resources to the Padlet for the academic librarian who had a question. The selection and reconsideration policy toolkit that's under related resources does have resources for academic libraries as well. And I did add a link for the AAUP Committee A as also. So you might want to consult those resources. I will leave you with one factoid. On Wednesday before Thanksgiving, our office received 12 different challenge reports in one day.
Yeah.
And that we're seeing multiple reports. We're having multiple reports sent to our office on a daily basis, which is, I've been quoted many times as saying this, but it's absolutely unprecedented. And I've worked in this office for 20 years and never seen anything like it.
And I want to, again, thank you for that. And I want to say Alicia Thompson, who is here at our Erie County BOCES, she had said she was looking around and kind of noticing like this uptick, just on a, on a more local level, right? That the chatter. And so to see how, someone here, noticed that and how that fits in with that big picture you're talking about, this is important work. And yeah, I'm glad everybody here spent the time to think about being ready, because it's so critical. So there's more to come on this. Thank you so much, Deborah, for dropping in. Caitlin, I'm going to turn it over to you for any last minute housekeeping, anything else we need to do.
Thank you, Cole. This was a great session, very informative, and I think it reassured a lot of our attendees today. I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. I will share follow-up information either tomorrow or next week, and we will compile the links that were shared today. Cole will also be sharing her slides that will be sent out to all the attendees, and the recording will be sent out next week. So any information that you missed or any links that you missed, please email me. I will get you what you need. I'll put my email in the chat one last time. Make sure you fill out the evaluation and the CE certificate forms if you need them. All right, thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good.